Hey, there we go. Well, here we are again. It's Sunday. I've been doing this on Sunday for lately anyway. Last several times. Sunday seems to be my day to do it and to upload it later that night. Anyhow, been kind of bouncing back and forth between, the manosphere stuff, the history stuff, and the anthropology stuff. I think it's time for a little anthropology talk. So let's talk about something bland and uncontroversial. Let's talk about race. Yeah. Anyway, what is race? You know, uh, is it something that obviously exists because you look in the mirror, you look at somebody, and you go, "Yep, that's this or that," or is it a or is it something that is all in our heads, doesn't exist, merely a social construct? Well, let's talk about it. Um, so yeah, like with a lot of things, I tend to be a moderate person. I tend to look at both sides and think, well, there's some degrees of good points on both sides, and if you meet in the middle, that's usually the best way. Some exceptions to that. On some issues, whether we're talking about politics or anything else, there's some issues where I take a more this or that approach, but a lot of controversial things, there is a grain of truth to both extremes of the opinion. And in this case, now there seems to be this camp that thinks that race is really obviously a thing that's, really important, or how shall I say, they think it's a big deal and something that's obvious, yada yada. And then there's another camp that's like, we're all just exactly the same. There's like no real difference except maybe, a very skin deep difference. Now, where do I come on this? Um, I am I am more on the side of the latter, I guess, but well, it's like this. The people, the sort of very, let's just call it what it is, the people who are either very racist, or in some cases just kind of have this old fashioned, I guess not everybody who has that view is necessarily a racist, but, the people on the first view that I talk about who think that race is very real and very much a big deal, they tend to think that it's like a category that's very like obvious and set in stone, and then the other side, says that this is just some like made up BS, that isn't even really a thing that has any concreteness. So as opposed to the view that race either is a concrete category or doesn't exist at all, I'm a little bit in between, but more towards the latter mentioned, because my view is that race, rather than being an extreme like category with brackets around it, and a category that's sort of set in stone, it's a flow. It's a it's one species, one people who have more in common as human beings. We're one species. We have more in common than we do differences. Nonetheless, I think that there are differences which are in some cases more than skin deep and might affect physical and mental attributes. But despite that, there's so much overlap and so much that we have in common, that those features, those differences, really aren't very extreme, and there's also a lot of crossover and muddy waters between all of it. Therefore, we should not make too big of a deal about race. But what is race? To me, race is a flow. It's like okay, as like I displayed my DNA a month ago, 3 weeks ago, whenever it was. I talked about my DNA, how I'm basically all European, except maybe a teeny tiny tenth of a percent. But what's a European? Well, if you go back far enough, Europeans come from Middle Eastern people to some degree. Okay, so we're kind of related to that. It's like, and then in turn, those Middle Eastern people are kind of related to African people. So it's a flow. It's not a and between these groups, there's been a lot of exchanging of DNA. So you dig back far enough, there's really no purity. There's no, except as a social construct. You can say, well, pure in the sense that in the last, 3,000 years, it's been this group interacting, yada yada. But I guess what I'm getting at is, okay, is race a social construct? It is in the sense of where you draw the line, because let's talk about the origin of the European people in particular, because as a person of European descent, I tend to be more interested in that. But not just that, the science or the history and ancestral science that has been, I think, studied more than other groups, although I'm sure other groups have been studied in a lot of detail that I'm not aware of. But I think I'm both more aware, and there's generally more info out there about the origins of Europeans per se. So let's get into it. Who are we as Europeans? So the first Europeans arrived maybe as far back as 50,000, maybe more like 46, 47,000 years ago. The first few waves, I believe, probably died off, and probably somewhere around roughly 40,000 years ago, we get some people who stayed in Europe and contributed to some degree to the DNA of who we are today. Where did they come from? They came from essentially the Middle East. And if you go back to 60, 70, 75,000 years ago, from Africa into the Middle East, or that is to say, wherever the origin, basically, as human beings, we all come from, or at least 90% of our DNA, 90 plus percent of our DNA, comes from one group, theoretically, that came out of Africa and then spread throughout the world. One tribe, or closely related tribe. Relatively recently, a long time ago in a certain sense, but relatively recently in evolutionary history. That said, we did some intermingling with Neanderthals and Denisovans and some other groups. There's evidence of some other groups in our DNA whose fossils we have not discovered. And I personally think also probably other Homo sapiens who were cousins of this group but not in this group per se. That's kind of just my opinion, because as we dig more into it, when they started to say this, it was like, 100% was just from this one group. But the more we dig into it, the more there's it's not quite 100%. So I think it's, that said, I think the science is legit, just maybe not perfect and maybe not quite that extreme. Therefore, my guess is 90%. The vast majority of our ancestors comes from this one group, roughly 70,000 years ago, out of Africa, or possibly out of the Middle East, according to some theories, or some combination of the Middle East and Africa, because when you look at where the Arabian Peninsula connects to Africa, it's really a similar geographic area we're talking about. Anywho, that was a lot to say in a. I got my caffeine going today, right? That was a lot to say in one mouthful. Yeah, yeah. Um, so anyway, European origins we're getting at. So starting 40,000 years ago, say 40-ish thousand years ago, a group out of the Middle East, roughly, comes into Europe, establishes itself enough to contribute to the ancestry of who we are today. You know, a group that gets there and survives essentially. Fast forward, fast forward several tens of thousands of years, and we have another group coming out of Anatolia, and this gets complicated because these people maybe came from some mixture of the Europeans and more Middle Eastern people, because Anatolia is where it's modern day Turkey and it's right next to Greece. So it's, the Middle East is here, Europe's here. Anatolia is kind of like an in between where these groups might have met and interacted and became a distinct people. So these Anatolians, so you've got a population of hunter gatherers living in Europe who've been there since 40,000 years ago, and then starting eight, nine-ish, 8.5-ish thousand years ago, an agricultural society out of Anatolia, people who knew how to farm, sort of more advanced people than the hunter-gatherer Europeans, although if you go back a few tens of thousands of years, maybe they come from some admixing of Europeans and Middle Easterners in Anatolia. That they spread into Europe and become sort of the basis of the peoples who are today the Southern Europeans, the Greeks, the Italians, the Spanish, the South Slavs to some extent, the Balkan area, the Iberian Peninsula, a little bit of the Southern French people, perhaps. But you've got these hunter-gatherer Europeans who are already there. Did they just disappear? No, they they mixed with. They didn't seem to mix a lot, but they mixed to a degree with these newcomers. So so here we have two parts of the ancestry of European Anatolian farmers, the indigenous Europeans. And as I talked about in another video talking about Cheddar Man and all that, these indigenous Europeans were generally dark skinned and maybe blue eyed, maybe not all of them, maybe a lot of them, but they were a darker skinned people. These Middle Eastern people were actually had a lighter skin tone than the Europeans because they had already been into agriculture for a few thousand years, and as I talked about, that diverse agricultural diet, not eating as much meat, not getting as much vitamin D from the meat, affected the skin tone. Now that said, they weren't quote unquote white people like today, but they were lighter. They were of a lighter skin tone than the first Europeans. And these first Europeans were still around, were still, some of them at least, dark skinned, but they were mixing with these lighter skinned people and becoming lighter skinned as they mixed with them and developed agriculture. Then, in the steppes of Eurasia, you have the first steppe Indo-Europeans, who are the language bearers of the European people as well as the Iranians and the peoples of India. We are not entirely descended from these people, but they are a significant part of the genetic equation and a very dominant, actually, linguistic component. These were the people who, in the steppes of in what is now like eastern Ukraine, southern European Russia, and maybe a bit, and possibly north of there, around the Baltic, that kind of thing. These people were steppe pastoralists who dabbled in agriculture, probably traded with agricultural societies, and they are thought to be some of the first people to adapt, to be like very light skin, have a very light skin tone, and also adapt the ability to digest dairy products. As herders, they may have been, very into the milk and the cheese, perhaps. These people spread west into Western Europe, and they encountered the Anatolian agriculturalists and the indigenous Europeans. And by the way, these steppe pastoralists, Indo-Europeans, they're descended mostly from the original European hunter-gatherers, but they changed. They kind of separated themselves a little bit in the east for a time, and they changed, maybe partially adopting agriculture, but adopting pastoralism and these other characteristics, and became something different, although related to the original Europeans. The point is they had enough genetic uniqueness, genetic mutations, whatever, that they became a distinct group. So it's essentially three groups we're talking about. Although it was kind of four, because these Indo-Europeans also intermixed with some peoples in the northern Caucasus, but then again, those people were probably kind of related to them anyway. Yada yada. For sake of simplicity, let's say three groups. Okay, the Anatolian farmers, the old hunter-gatherers of Europe, and the Indo-European pastoralists who brought the language, who seem to have dominated somewhere around 7,000 years ago, sort of took over Europe, so to speak, and dominated in terms of language. These groups eventually all mix. They all intermarried, and if you're a Southern European, you're probably about 25% descended from the steppe Indo-Europeans, and 7-ish% descended from the hunter-gatherers, and the remainder, 60 something percent, from the farmers, the Anatolian farmers. And if you're Central European, you're kind of 50-50-ish between, generally speaking, and this is generally speaking, everybody's got their own kind of unique blend of this stuff. If you're a Central European, like a Southern German, like the French, probably in Western Ukraine, etc., you're probably around 50-50 between the southern, not counting the 7%, which is kind of stable, but whatever, it would be 41% farmer, 41% steppe pastoralists, and 7%, 7-8-ish% indigenous hunter-gatherer European. And then if you're a Northern European, it's kind of the flip of Southern European. You're probably 65-ish% steppe pastoralists, 7%, again, indigenous European, and then 30-ish something percent Anatolian farmer. So we're all a mix. mix of these three people. But if you go back far enough, these three people were sort of related, sort of from a mix of Middle Eastern tribes that were kind of related. So, so what's a European? That's the question. If we're all a mix of these people, then where do you draw the line on what's what? Because and it goes down to the individual level. Like those numbers I was talking about, those are all generalities. Like, but an individual Italian might have a much higher percent of one ancestry or the other. Might be an individual Italian might have a genetic composition that's kind of more like a Norwegian, for example, because the genes are, the breeding's always a little different for everybody. The genes are falling around in different ways throughout all this, and then the peoples of India also have steppe Indo-European genes. So does that mean people from India are white? If you know, if the upper class of India is in parts of India, at least northern India, the upper class members are 30-ish% steppe Indo-European. Does that mean they're quote unquote white people, even if their skin is a lot darker? That's where you get into, is it a social service? Is it a social construct? It kind of is, because you could socially say, like, hey, people in India, despite being very dark skinned, they're basically quote unquote white because they had enough European ancestry 4,000 years ago. A bunch of steppe Indo-Europeans went down there and dominated their culture and significantly injected themselves into the gene pool. They're kind of white, but they're so dark skinned. How can you call them white? Well, some Middle Eastern people are lighter in skin tone, and are kind of related, sorta, to those Anatolian farmers. Are they white? Even though they have relatively little steppe Indo-European. Now there is some steppe Indo-Europeans did go down to the Middle East, what we would now today call the Middle East, but they didn't. Their language didn't catch on the way it did in India, so the language remains Semitic, and the percent is also relatively small, but it is there among the Middle Eastern peoples. Notable exceptions include the Yazidi and the Yazidi people and the Kurdish, which which speak an Indo-European language and have a higher percent of steppe Indo-European ancestry. So, wow, this is getting longer than I thought, and I've been talking fast. So I hope somebody's getting something out of this. This is just me babbling as an anthropology nerd. I'm not making this up. I'm not BSing, but you've got the internet. You can latch on to something I said and look it up and verify it. And I'm sure there's contradictory things, contradictory opinions, yada yada. But yeah. Using back to the main subject of race more generally, using Europeans as a base example, it's kind of like that for all peoples. Like Native Americans come from a tribe, come from like 2/3 of their ancestry is from a group of people who are pretty closely related to Asiatic peoples like the Chinese, etc. And 1/3 of their ancestry is from an ancient people who were more related to ancient Eurasian, ancient West Eurasians, more like Europeans, although because it happened so long ago, like Europeans before we became white. Nonetheless, some of the bone structure of some tribes might resemble Europeans. And that's another thing. There's a general bone structure framework, but it's which people believed in strongly like 100 years ago, but today is kind of dismissed because there's so much overlap. There's sort of this general Caucasian type, but then there's a lot of black people and some Asian people who have that Caucasian type, so it's kind of thrown out as and some Caucasians who might have the quote unquote Negroid type, that kind of thing. It's a thing that I think generally has some legitimacy, but it's been found to have so much overlap and vagueness that it's largely rejected by modern anthropologists. So, yeah, but yeah, back to what I was kind of getting at a minute ago. Other Europeans and other races have this same sort of flow. Like you go back far enough, we come from different people. You go back even further, it's the same people, not counting our small percent Neanderthal and whatever else might be there. Do you see what I'm getting at? It's a flow. It's we're all related, but we've been separated for some tens of thousands of years, a few tens of thousands of years. Some differences have occurred, but not in this puritanical kind of way, not in this kind of we're one thing and it's as simple as that. It's more complicated. It's not any kind of purity. Nonetheless, to say that nothing happened evolutionarily in 20,000 years, 30,000 years, 40,000 years, I think is also not exactly right. Some differences, probably more so than even just the skin tone stuff, have no doubt evolved during that period of time. But by the same token, compared to what people thought 120 years ago, turn of the 20th century, oh, these people over here, they're like a whole different species. No, we're much more alike than we are different. But there is a flow of difference. So that's my opinion. A flow, race is a flow. It's a social construct in the sense it's not purely a social construct, but it's a social construct in the sense that where we draw the lines in that flow is constructed socially. And almost a half hour. I think I'll leave it there. Those are my thoughts on anthropology today, on race. And I'm not an expert. I'm just some douchebag in a muscle shirt trying who's interested in this stuff. But those are some of my thoughts on race today. I think I've jabbered and maybe got myself in trouble enough. I probably pissed off both sides a little bit. So let's say goodbye and see you next time.